What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA Wednesday, March 17th. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, we have a 10-game slate tonight, so there's lots of options here on the table. So let's take a look at the point guard position. I'm going to give you a value play. I like Tomas Satoransky from the Chicago Bulls playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Tomas Satoransky has averaged 18.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 21 minutes per game with a 15% usage rate. He scored 33, 34, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 25, and 15 minutes. Now he's projected at 27 fantasy points here tonight. That projection may be a little bit high, but he has scored over 30 fantasy points the last 2 games, but I would expect him to get more around 20 to 25 fantasy points, which would still be 5 times value or more, because he's only $3,900 FanDuel salary and 100 less on DraftKings. Now, he scored 31, 10, 46, 23, and 18 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Spurs, so he's got pretty good player versus team history. Now, he could revert to his average and only get you, 15 to 18 fantasy points, or he could also get you a 5 or a 7. So there's a little bit of risk with this play, but his salary is low enough where he doesn't need much to hit value. He's been playing a lot of minutes lately, and he's been productive, and he's in a good matchup. So I like Tomas Satoransky here versus the San Antonio Spurs. Okay, another point guard that I like is Malcolm Brogdon from the Indiana Pacers playing the Brooklyn Nets, who have the 11th worst defense overall. And although they've been pretty good against opposing point guards, Malcolm Brogdon has averaged 38.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 26% usage rate. He scored 36, 37, and 44 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 33, 34, and 35 minutes. He's projected at 37.7 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.4 times value. He's 7,000 FanDuel salary and 200 more on DraftKings. Now he scored 31, 14, and 57 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Nets, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 232.5 points scored in this game, so you got a high scoring game. It's a good game to stack, so I like Malcolm Brogdon here versus the Brooklyn Nets. Okay, another point guard that I like is Kyrie Irving from the Brooklyn Nets playing the Indiana Pacers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing point guards. Kyrie Irving has averaged 44.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 30% usage rate. He scored 41, 38, and 57 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 36, 35, and 34 minutes. He's projected at 45.6 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's $9,100 FanDuel salary and the same price on DraftKings. He scored 59, 50, and 27 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Pacers. I think he can get close to 50 fantasy points here tonight and get you 5 times value or more. So I like Kyrie Irving here versus the Indiana Pacers. Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. Now, this is a FanDuel play for me. I think he is playable on both sites, but he is a smash FanDuel play. I like Karis LeVert from the Indiana Pacers playing the Brooklyn Nets, who have the 11th worst defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing shooting guards. Caris LeVert has averaged 33.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 31% usage rate. He scored 30 and 20 fantasy points in the last 2 games, playing 29 and 26 minutes. He's projected at 34 fantasy points here tonight, and on FanDuel, that's 7.7 times value. He's only $4,400 FanDuel salary, but he is $2,400 more on DraftKings, so it's not as appealing as a DraftKings play, but he's definitely a lock for me on FanDuel. Looks like another pricing mistake. They had his price really low last game as well. He scored 30 fantasy points in 29 minutes, so great FanDuel play here. So I like Caris LeVert, especially on FanDuel here versus the Brooklyn Nets. Okay, another shooting guard that I like is Paul George from the LA Clippers playing the Dallas Mavericks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing shooting guards, Paul George has averaged 39.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 29% usage rate. He scored 25, 22, and 41 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 37, 23, and 26 minutes. So Paul George has cooled off a little bit the past couple of games, but he's projected at 38.7 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.1 times value. He's $7,600 FanDuel salary and $300 more on DraftKings. So Paul George has scored 25, 19, 31, 40, and 24 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Mavericks. Not exceptional, not great player versus team history. Looks like he would have only got you 5 times value or more 1 out of those 5 games versus the Mavericks. But Vegas thinks there's going to be 226.5 points scored in this game. I just think his salary is reasonable. He's got 50 plus fantasy point upside. He's cooled off the past couple of games, so I think he gets it going again tonight. So I like Paul George here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won, and then we'll send you $100 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you. Okay, another shooting guard that I like is Tyler Hero from the Miami Heat playing the Memphis Grizzlies, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Tyler Hero has averaged 28.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He scored 23, 40, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 31, 29, and 23 minutes. He's projected at 26.6 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's $5,300 FanDuel salary and the same price on DraftKings. And he scored 35 and 30 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Grizzlies. Vegas thinks there's going to be 221 points scored in this game. So I like Tyler Hero here versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Okay, let's take a look at the small forward position. I like Jaylen Brown from the Boston Celtics playing the Cleveland Cavaliers, who have the 12th worst defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing small forwards, Jaylen Brown has averaged 39.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 30% usage rate. He scored 51, 27, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 38, 26, and 40 minutes. He's projected at 39.4 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.4 times value. He's $7,300 FanDuel salary and $400 more on DraftKings. Now, this is a back-to-back, but he's a young player. He should be able to get out there and play plenty of minutes. And he scored 43, 45, and 34 fantasy points in the last 3 games versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. So I like Jaylen Brown here versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. Now, a nice value play that I like, even though he hasn't been playing as well lately, if you are looking for a value play, take a look at Nicholas Batum from the LA Clippers playing the Dallas Mavericks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing small forwards. Nicholas Batum has averaged 21.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 29 minutes per game with a 12% usage rate. He scored 22, 17, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 25, 19, and 15 minutes. He's projected at 20.1 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.6 times value. He's only $3,600 FanDuel salary and $300 more on DraftKings. So a reasonable price on both sites. He can get you 25 fantasy points or more. Even if he only gets you his season average, that's well over 5 times value. So I think he makes a pretty nice value play, especially on FanDuel, but that price is good on both sites. He scored 22, 12, and 34 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Mavericks. So I like Nicholas Batum as a value play here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, another small forward that I like is Harrison Barnes from the Sacramento Kings playing the Washington Wizards, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Harrison Barnes has averaged 30.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with an 18% usage rate. He scored 25, 24, and 35 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 36, 39, and 31 minutes. He's projected at 31 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.1 times value. He's $6,100 FanDuel salary and $400 more on DraftKings. Now, he scored 24, 29, 26, 43, and 37 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Wizards. It's a fantastic matchup, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 245.5 points scored in this game. So this is another good game to stack. Great matchup. So I like Harrison Barnes here versus the Washington Wizards. Okay, let's take a look at the power forward position. Once again, I like Lauri Markkanen from the Chicago Bulls playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing power forwards. Lauri Markkanen has averaged 29.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He scored 35, 29, and 28 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32, 32, and 33 minutes. He's projected at 29.5 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.1 times value. He's $5,800 FanDuel salary and the same price on DraftKings. He scored 43, 12, and 27 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Spurs. Vegas thinks there's going to be 227.5 points scored in this game. It is a back-to-back, but he should still get around 30 minutes this game, and he has a good chance at getting you 5 times value or more. So I like Lauri Markkanen here versus the San Antonio Spurs.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, I'm going to give you a value play here. I like Marcus Morris from the LA Clippers playing the Dallas Mavericks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Marcus Morris has averaged 19.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 24 minutes per game with a 20% usage rate. He scored 28, 4, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 19, and 23 minutes. He's projected at 18.5 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's $3,700 FanDuel salary and $400 more on DraftKings. Now, he scored 28, 13, 27, and 21 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Mavericks. So I would go, if you're looking for a value play, I would go with either Nicholas Batum or Marcus Morris from the LA Clippers. I wouldn't play both of them. You could do that, but I would pick your favorite value play from those 2 guys. Their salary is both pretty low. They both got 25 to 30 fantasy point upside. They got a chance to crush their value. So I like Marcus Morris here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, another power forward that I like is Jerami Grant from the Detroit Pistons playing the Toronto Raptors, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Jerami Grant has averaged 37.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 28% usage rate. He scored 22, 29, and 47 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 26, 35, and 33 minutes. So he's cooled down the past couple of games, but he's got some monster upside. He's got 50 plus fantasy point upside. He is projected at 35.2 fantasy points here tonight, which is 4.9 times value. But if he gets his season average of 37.4, that would be 5 times value or more. He's $7,200 FanDuel salary and $100 more on DraftKings. Vegas thinks there's going to be 220.5 points scored in this game. It's a good matchup. I like his price on both sites, so I like Jerami Grant here versus the Toronto Raptors. Okay, moving on to the center position. I'm going to give you a FanDuel value play here. I like Cody Zeller from the Charlotte Hornets playing the Denver Nuggets, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing centers. Cody Zeller has averaged 24.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 23 minutes per game with an 18% usage rate. He scored 22, 24, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 18, 22, and 26 minutes. He's projected at 24.4 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.7 times value. He's $4,300 FanDuel salary, but he's $700 more on DraftKings. So this is a FanDuel play for me. Vegas thinks there's going to be 231 points scored in this game, and he scored 22, 22, 22, and 20 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Nuggets. I think he can get his season average here of 24 fantasy points and get you well over 5 times value on FanDuel. So I like Cody Zeller here versus the Denver Nuggets. Now, I did have this guy marked, but I've given you so many players from the Indiana Pacers already. But if you do want to play this guy, I think he's a decent play. I like Miles Turner from the Indiana Pacers playing the Brooklyn Nets, who have the 11th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Miles Turner has averaged 34.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 31 minutes per game with a 17% usage rate. He scored 32, 44, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 29, and 27 minutes. He's projected at 34.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.6 times value. He's $6,100 FanDuel salary and $200 less on DraftKings. So I like that price on both sites, but especially on DraftKings, where it's hard to find these low salary players that have a big upside.
because DraftKings always seems to have their players overpriced. So he scored 9, 27, 27, 9, and 23 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Brooklyn Nets. So a word of caution there. He does not have very good player versus team history, but I just think his salary is so low on DraftKings, only $5,900 DraftKings salary, and he's averaging 34.4 fantasy points per game on the season. So if he gets you 30 to 35 fantasy points, you'll be hitting your value there. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 232.5 points scored in this game. So a lot of fantasy points to go around. So I like Miles Turner here versus the Brooklyn Nets. Now guys, this is a 10-game slate, so you don't have to jam in all these players from the Indiana Pacers Brooklyn game. I think I've given you 4 players already from this game. There's plenty of options here out on the table. I would play max probably 2 players from the Pacers if you want to go with that and run it back with Kyrie Irving. But there's a lot of good options on the Pacers, especially on FanDuel. You got to play Karis LeVert, and then you could throw in either Miles Turner or Malcolm Brogdon. But anyways, let's move on here. Another center that I like is Rashaan Holmes from the Sacramento Kings playing the Washington Wizards, who have the second worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing centers. Rashaan Holmes has averaged 32.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 30 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He scored 61, 36, and 39 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 40, 35, and 34 minutes. He's projected at 34.2 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's $6,900 FanDuel salary and $200 less on DraftKings. So I like that price on both sites, and I love that DraftKings price. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 245.5 points scored in this game. So this is another game you want to get some exposure to. So I like Rashaan Holmes here versus the Washington Wizards.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.